The sound reached him before the shapes did. A low drone from the west, steady, not rising and falling the way a single staffel sounded when it passed overhead. This held one pitch, one unbroken tone that pressed against the windows of the dispersal hut and did not let go. The mechanic, records identify him only by rank, Obergefreiter, attached to a fighter unit operating from a stripped-back field east of Wesel, stepped outside and looked up. What he saw filled the sky from the southwest horizon to a point almost directly above him, and it kept coming. Formations stacked at different altitudes, contrails braiding together until the upper layers blurred into a white ceiling. Transports, fighters, more transports. The formation did not end. He turned back toward the blast pens, where 3 Messerschmitt 109s sat fueled and armed. His pilot stood next to them. None of them moved toward a cockpit. If you've served, or someone in your family served, drop their name, their branch, their war in the comments. Subscribe if this channel speaks to you. Hit like so this reaches the ones who carried the weight. The men on that airfield in 1945 made a calculation, and it should be understood on its own terms. March 24, 1945. Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne assault in history, launched that morning in support of the Rhine crossing at Wesel. 17,000 airborne troops carried by roughly 1,500 transport aircraft and 1,300 gliders, escorted by nearly 900 fighters. The American contribution alone dwarfed anything the Luftwaffe could still put into the air across the entire Western Front. 9th Troop Carrier Command and elements of RAF Transport Command flew in columns that stretched over 70 miles. The first serials crossed the Rhine at 10 a.m. The last didn't clear until after 1 in the afternoon. 3 hours of continuous aircraft overhead, at altitudes low enough to read the star and bar markings without binoculars. The Luftwaffe by this date fielded perhaps 750 operational fighters on the Western Front. Sources conflict on the exact number. Gallen's post-war estimate runs lower. Oberkommando der Luftwaffe daily strength returns run higher, and neither accounts cleanly for aircraft that technically existed but lacked fuel, parts, or trained pilots to fly them. What matters is the ratio. For every German fighter that could theoretically take off that morning, there were 3 or 4 American escort fighters waiting for it, plus the massed defensive guns of the transport stream itself. A C-47 carried no forward-firing armament, but a formation of 300 of them, with waist gunners, created a wall of 30 caliber fire that no sane flight leader wanted to charge into head-on. The Obergefreiter's pilots understood this arithmetic instantly. They did not need a briefing. They could hear it. This is the detail that hooks into something deeper than one morning over the Rhine. By March 1945, Luftwaffe fighter pilots on the Western Front had developed what their own leadership called a reluctance to engage. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, relieved as General der Jagdflieger 2 months earlier, described the situation in his post-war foreign military studies interview with an almost clinical detachment. He noted that experienced pilots had been killed in such numbers through 1944 that replacement pilots arrived at frontline units with 60 to 80 hours total flight time. American pilots crossed the Atlantic with over 200. The new German pilots died fast. The ones who survived long enough to understand what they faced became, in Galland's framing, operationally reluctant, not cowards. Rational men inside an irrational system. According to a 12th Army Group intelligence summary compiled in April 1945, captured Luftwaffe personnel described standing orders that were functionally impossible to obey: scramble against any Allied formation, engage bombers at all costs, protect the homeland at every point along the front. The orders assumed resources that no longer existed: fuel reserves, replacement engines, pilots who could handle a 109 in combat against a P-51, flown by someone with 400 hours and gun camera film to prove it. Faced with the gap between orders and reality, individual Staffeln made their own decisions. Some flew, most did not. The intelligence summary uses a phrase that sticks: Gruppenlevel paralysis. That phrase, Gruppenlevel paralysis, did not describe fear in the way a civilian might understand it. It described a military organization that had lost the ability to generate sorties against an enemy whose presence in the sky made sortie generation suicidal. The Luftwaffe still had planes and ammunition, still had men willing to die for Germany in the abstract. What it lacked, specifically and fatally, on the morning of March 24th over the Rhine, stood outside on a frozen taxiway, staring at a formation so large it took 3 hours to pass, and concluded that climbing into a cockpit meant dying before reaching combat altitude. To understand why that formation existed at all, why the United States could put that many aircraft over one river crossing on one morning in the 4th year of a global war, while simultaneously fighting across the Pacific, requires going backward, not to 1945, not even to 1942, when the production numbers started climbing. Back to 1939 and 1940, when decisions made in factories and flight schools and congressional hearings built the machine that would fill a German sky so completely that trained fighter pilots refused to start their engines. The Obergefreiter's pilots never took off that morning. Their names aren't recorded. Their aircraft survived the day, which means they probably burned on the ground within the week as Allied forces pushed east. The pilots likely walked away from the war, or tried to. The Luftwaffe of 1939 did not lose air superiority. It gave it away, one dead instructor at a time. This requires emphasis because the collapse visible over the Rhine in March 1945 looks inevitable in hindsight. It wasn't. The force that opened the war owned every sky it entered. Poland fell in days partly because German air doctrine, close air support integrated with armored thrusts, communications between ground and air that no other military had perfected, made resistance above the tree line impossible. France in 1940 saw the same pattern amplified. The RAF lost 471 aircraft in the Battle of France across 6 weeks. Experienced British and French pilots died in encounters with Luftwaffe veterans who had trained for years in secret, built unit cohesion through the Spanish Civil War, and entered the wider conflict with more combat hours than any air force on Earth. Over Crete in 1941, over the Western Desert, over the approaches to Malta, German pilots operated with a confidence born from institutional excellence. Their gunnery training consumed ammunition at rates the pre-war Reichsluftfahrtministerium considered essential, and post-war Luftwaffe commanders admitted they could never sustain once attrition began eating the training base. That last detail matters more than any production figure. Germany built roughly 113,000 aircraft across the entire war. Impressive in isolation. The United States built 324,000, but numbers alone didn't kill the Luftwaffe. What killed it operated on a simpler mechanism. Every experienced pilot who died over the Reich in 1943 and 1944 took with him knowledge that could not be replaced at the speed the front demanded. The Americans understood this. 8th Air Force's strategic campaign against Germany served two purposes simultaneously: destroying industrial targets and forcing Luftwaffe fighters to rise and fight, where American escorts could kill them. General Jimmy Doolittle's decision in early 1944 to unleash his P-51s from close bomber escort and send them hunting across the German countryside changed the arithmetic permanently. Fighters no longer waited for German interceptors to attack the bomber stream. They went looking, strafing airfields, catching trainers in the pattern. Big Week, 6 days in February 1944, cost the Luftwaffe an estimated 600 aircraft and, critically, pilots it could not replace from a training pipeline already running on fumes. The fuel crisis compounded everything. Allied bombing of synthetic oil plants through the summer of 1944 cut Luftwaffe aviation fuel production from 175,000 tons in April to 52,000 tons by June, then to 17,000 by September. Training flights, already shortened from pre-war standards, dropped to near zero for new pilots. A replacement arriving at a Jagdgeschwader in October 1944 might have 60 hours total time, 20 of those in type. His first combat sortie against Americans, who had 200, 300, sometimes 400 hours, meant he survived an average of 4 missions. The actuarial math broke the force faster than any bomb. Plosti's loss in August 1944 removed Romania's oil fields from German control entirely. The 15th Air Force had been hitting those refineries since 1943. By the time Soviet ground forces overran the area, German reserves existed in drums, hidden in forests, not in depots, feeding operational squadrons. A Jagdgruppe commander in the West during that autumn faced a choice no doctrine addressed: fly training sorties and burn fuel that combat missions needed, or send untrained pilots into combat and watch them die. Both options produced the same outcome at different speeds. Then, Bodenplatte. January 1, 1945. The Luftwaffe's final offensive gamble in the West, a massed low-level strike against Allied airfields in Belgium, Holland, and northern France. Nearly 900 German fighters launched at dawn. They destroyed or damaged roughly 300 Allied aircraft on the ground. A tactical success on paper. The cost: 271 German aircraft lost, many to their own flak gunners who hadn't been informed of the operation. 143 pilots killed, 70 captured. Among the dead and missing, squadron leaders and Staffelkapitän, the last men who knew how to lead a formation into combat and bring pieces of it home. The Allied aircraft destroyed on the ground at Eindhoven, and Metz could be replaced from American factories within 2 weeks. The German pilots who died over those same fields could not be replaced at all. General Major Dietrich Peltz, who planned Bodenplatte, never publicly admitted the operation destroyed more German capability than Allied, but a Luftwaffe Oberst, captured 3 months later and held at Trent Park, spoke with another prisoner in terms the hidden microphones recorded clearly. He said, "We used our last experienced men to destroy planes the Americans could build in a week. Now we have the planes and no one who can fly them into a fight." The British intelligence transcribers underlined the passage. 82 days separated Bodenplatte from the morning over Wesel. In those 82 days, the Luftwaffe on the Western Front received replacement aircraft from factories still operating under dispersal programs Albert Speer had organized through 1944. Messerschmitt 109s arrived by rail at depots. Focke-Wulf 190. D9 sat in revetments with full fuel tanks, a minor miracle given the supply situation. Ammunition stocks for 20mm and 30mm cannon remained adequate at many forward fields. The machines existed. The men to fly them in combat against what filled the sky on March 24th did not, or rather, they existed physically, standing beside their aircraft on a frozen taxiway, watching a formation pass that their training had not prepared them to fight, and their experience told them they could not survive. The Luftwaffe that once owned every sky it entered couldn't generate 3 sorties against 1,500 transports crossing a river in broad daylight. Willow Run's assembly line ran a mile long. A B-24 Liberator rolled off the end of it every 55 minutes by the summer of 1944. Henry Ford had promised 1 per hour, and his engineers beat the number, which irritated him. Ford wanted round figures in his press releases. The plant employed 42,000 workers at peak capacity, most of them women, most of them trained in under 4 weeks. A Liberator contained 488,000 rivets. The women drove them faster than the Army Air Forces could assign crews to fly the finished bombers away. That single factory produced more 4-engine heavy bombers in 1944 than the entire German aviation industry produced fighters of all types in 1942. One building in Ypsilanti, Michigan, against every Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf plant in the Reich combined. The comparison borders on absurd, but the production records from the War Production Board confirm it without qualification. Willow Run delivered 18,482 Liberators across its operational life. Douglas, Consolidated, and North American ran parallel lines for other types. The country built nearly 13,000 B-17s, over 3,000 B-29s, 15,600 P-51 Mustangs, the fighter that went hunting over Germany while the bombers did their work above. The numbers become numbing, which is exactly the point. They numbed the Luftwaffe too, except the Luftwaffe had to fight against them rather than simply read them on a page. The aircraft meant nothing without pilots to fly them, and this is where the American advantage turned, from impressive to structurally impossible to answer. The Army Air Force's Training Command operated roughly 1,200 airfields across the continental United States by mid-1944. Texas alone held more training bases than the Luftwaffe operated across occupied Europe. The Gulf Coast Training Center pushed cadets through primary, basic, and advanced phases in a pipeline, so relentless that bottlenecks occurred not because of too few students, but because finished pilots stacked up at replacement depots waiting for unit assignments. The Training Command graduated over 65,000 pilots in 1943, 65,000 in a single calendar year. Germany graduated fewer than 10,000 in the same period, and the gap widened every month after that as fuel shortages strangled German training hours towards zero. An American cadet entered the pipeline with ground school and emerged roughly 10 months later with over 200 hours of flight time, 200 hours before he ever saw a combat theater. His instrument training alone exceeded the total flight time of many Luftwaffe replacements arriving at frontline Jagdgeschwader by late 1944. The fuel to sustain this pipeline came from Texas and Oklahoma and California in quantities that German planners, studying American capacity through intelligence reports, dismissed as propaganda. According to a captured Luftwaffe staff study from early 1944, German intelligence estimated American pilot training fuel consumption at roughly 4 times their own. The actual ratio ran closer to 8-to-1. The staff study's authors noted this discrepancy and concluded the American figures must include non-training consumption, folded into the totals for bureaucratic reasons. They could not accept that a country would burn that much aviation gasoline solely to teach men how to fly, because accepting it meant accepting that the production war had already ended. The training didn't just produce volume, it produced quality at volume, and that combination broke every assumption the Luftwaffe held about attrition warfare. American gunnery schools in Florida and Arizona fired live ammunition in quantities that made the pre-war Luftwaffe's generous training allotments look restrained. Fighter pilots at advanced schools flew mock combat against instructors who had rotated home from combat tours. Men who knew what a Focke-Wulf 190 looked like in a gunsight and could teach a cadet to lead a target at 300 yards deflection before he'd ever heard flak burst near his canopy. The rotation policy itself represented a luxury no other air force could afford. The Americans pulled experienced combat pilots out of theater after a set number of missions, sent them home to teach, then eventually returned them for a second tour. This cycled hard-won knowledge back through the training base continuously. Germany kept its best pilots flying until they died. Each experte who fell over the Reich took his skills into the wreckage with him. The Americans distributed those skills across thousands of classrooms in dozens of states and let compound interests do the work. By January 1945, the 8th Air Force could launch over 1,000 heavy bombers on a single mission and assign each box a dedicated fighter escort drawn from groups that had been flying together for months. 1,000 bomber raids stopped being an event. It became a scheduling decision. The mission boards at High Wycombe listed them the way a railroad listed departures: which groups, which targets, what time, next. 9th Air Force's tactical fighters and fighter bombers, meanwhile, operated from bases on the continent with supply lines so short that a P-47 group could fly 4 sorties per aircraft per day during active ground support operations. 4 sorties. A Luftwaffe Jagdgruppe in the same period struggled to generate 1 sortie per serviceable aircraft per week. The surplus extended beyond aircraft and pilots into everything that kept an air force functioning: mechanics, armorers, radar operators, weathermen, cooks. 8th Air Force's ground echelon in England numbered over 185,000 personnel. The entire operational strength of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm on the Western Front by March 1945 fit inside a mid-sized American university's football stadium with seats to spare. The machine that filled the sky over Wessel on March 24th didn't strain to produce that formation. It barely noticed. We have destroyed their air force on the ground and lost ours in the air. That line appears in a post-war debriefing of a Luftwaffe Oberstleutnant held at a camp in England, paraphrased across several accounts but consistent in its thrust. He commanded a Gruppe that launched 32 fighters on the morning of January 1st, 1945. 11 came back. The plan had a name, Bodenplatte, baseplate, and a logic that made sense if you squinted hard enough and ignored everything the Luftwaffe had learned about Allied replacement capacity over the previous 18 months. General Major Dietrich Peltz assembled roughly 850 fighters and fighter bombers from units across the Western Front, assigned each Gruppe a specific Allied airfield in Belgium, Holland, or northern France, and ordered a simultaneous dawn strike to catch Allied aircraft on the ground during New Year's hangovers. The operational security bordered on paranoid. Briefings happened hours before takeoff, maps distributed at the last minute. Pathfinder aircraft, Junkers 88 night fighters equipped with navigation aids, would lead each formation to its target because most of the attacking pilots lacked the experience to navigate at low level across unfamiliar terrain in winter darkness. Peltz knew what kind of force he commanded. He pressed forward anyway. The first formations crossed their own lines around 8:15 a.m. They flew at treetop height to avoid Allied radar, which worked. The approach achieved genuine surprise at most target airfields. Eindhoven, Metz-Frascati, Brussels-Evere, Sint-Denis-Westrum, Asch, at field after field, German fighters swept in at 50 feet and found rows of parked Typhoons, Spitfires, P-47s, B-25s sitting wing to wing in the open. Strafing runs shredded aluminum and set fuel tanks burning. At Eindhoven alone, the attack destroyed or damaged over 100 aircraft belonging to RAF 2nd Tactical Air Force. Pilots in the attacking formations later described the satisfaction of watching explosions ripple down a flight line, each parked aircraft catching fire from the one beside it. For roughly 15 minutes, Bodenplatte looked like a masterstroke. The unraveling started on the return flights. German flak batteries along the front had not been informed of the operation. Peltz's security obsession meant that the very gun crews responsible for protecting the corridors these fighters needed to fly home through had no idea friendly aircraft would be crossing their positions at low altitude. When hundreds of single-engine fighters came roaring back east across the lines, some trailing smoke, some in loose formations that looked nothing like organized Luftwaffe operations, the flak gunners did exactly what their training demanded. They opened fire, 20mm and 37mm guns designed to kill aircraft at precisely the altitude these fighters flew, tore into formations already disorganized by combat. Pilots who had survived Allied ground fire and the handful of interceptors that scrambled from undamaged fields now died over their own territory, killed by their own countrymen operating exactly as trained. The records from several flak units show no hesitation. Aircraft approached at low level from the west. The gunners engaged. Dozens fell. Allied fighters compounded the slaughter. At Asch Airfield, designated Y-29, the 352nd Fighter Group had aircraft already warming up for a morning patrol when the German strike arrived. P-51s of the 487th Fighter Squadron scrambled directly into the attacking Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, shooting down several before the German pilots understood they faced airborne opposition. Other fields got fighters up within minutes. P-47s from 9th Air Force bases caught retreating German formations strung out at low altitude, with no energy to maneuver and no formation discipline left to mount a collective defense. Individual German pilots, already low on fuel and ammunition from their strafing runs, found thunderbolts diving on them from above with full loads. The kill ratios in these pursuit engagements ran catastrophically one-sided. The final accounting took weeks to assemble because the Luftwaffe's own reporting structure had fractured. Roughly 271 German aircraft confirmed lost. Some estimates run higher, over 300, depending on how damaged beyond repair airframes get counted. 143 pilots killed, 70 captured, which meant they walked through the rest of the war behind wire. Among the dead, 3 Geschwaderkommandoren, 5 Gruppenkommandure, 14 Staffelkapitane. Unit commanders and formation leaders, the men whose experience kept younger pilots alive long enough to learn. Replacing a Messerschmitt 109 took a factory 6 weeks. Replacing a Staffelkapitän with 300 combat sorties took. Nothing could replace him. The knowledge died in a Belgian field, or a German flak zone, or the cockpit of a burning fighter, gliding into trees east of Aachen. The Allied side absorbed the blow with an indifference that revealed the asymmetry more clearly than any battle could. 300 aircraft destroyed or damaged on the ground. Sounds devastating until you learn that 9th Air Force's replacement pipeline delivered new P-47s faster than ground crews could paint unit markings on them. Within 2 weeks, every airfield hit by Bodenplatte operated at full strength. Some units reported higher aircraft availability after the attack than before it, because the replacements arriving from depots carried newer modifications than the planes they replaced. The institutional response amounted to annoyance, not crisis. A 9th Air Force after-action report treated Bodenplatte as a maintenance problem rather than a combat emergency. Peltz spent the rest of the war watching the force he'd built for that single morning dissolve into the general collapse. 82 days later, 3 Messerschmitt 109s sat armed and fueled on a field east of the Rhine, while 1,500 transports darkened the sky above them. Their pilots stood in the cold and did arithmetic that Bodenplatte had already solved. The flight manifest for the 9th Troop Carrier Command on March 24, 1945, filled 14 mimeographed pages. Serials, tail numbers, cargo loads, drop zones, time on target windows, each page dense with the bureaucratic detail of moving 16,000 armed men through the air and depositing them on the far side of the Rhine River in daylight. 14 pages of single-spaced type to describe what a German flak crew on the ground would experience as a shadow that moved from horizon to horizon and did not end. Operation Varsity paired with Operation Plunder, the ground crossing under Field Marshal Montgomery's command, to create the largest single-day airborne assault in history. It dwarfed Normandy's airborne component and Market Garden alike. 1,696 transport aircraft, mostly C-47s and C-46s, towed or carried 1,348 gliders, loaded with troops, jeeps, artillery pieces, ammunition. The transports flew in formations 9 ships wide. The stream stretched back from the drop zones near Wesel across the Rhine, across the Allied rear areas, across eastern France, all the way to departure airfields in England and on the continent. A single observer standing on a hill east of the river and watching the formation pass from first aircraft to last would have stood there for roughly 2 hours and 40 minutes. The column covered something close to 200 miles of sky. Over 900 fighters flew escort and suppression missions in every direction around it. P-51s from 8th Air Force swept the route clean of anything airborne. P-47s from 9th Air Force carried bombs and rockets to hit flak positions in advance of the transports. Tempests from the RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force plugged gaps. The escort alone outnumbered the entire operational Luftwaffe fighter strength on the Western Front by a factor the after-action reports don't bother to calculate because the ratio had stopped being militarily meaningful. Facing this formation posed a problem that arithmetic solved before tactics entered the conversation. A staffel of Messerschmitt 109s, 12 aircraft, perhaps 8 serviceable on a good morning, would need to climb to intercept altitude, form up, navigate to the stream, pick an entry point, and attack. The moment those 8 fighters entered the formation's airspace, they faced transports defended by gunners in every aircraft and bracketed by roving flights of 4 to 8 American fighters, whose pilots had been briefed to treat any German aircraft within 15 miles of the column as a priority kill. 8 109s against 900 escorts. Even if every German pilot scored a kill on his first pass, an absurd hypothetical given the defensive firepower, the formation would lose 8 transports out of nearly 1,700, less than 0.5%. The staffel would cease to exist in the next 90 seconds as P-51s converged from multiple directions with altitude advantage and numerical superiority so vast that collision with friendly fighters posed a greater risk than German resistance. The Luftwaffe's operations staff understood this math. Sources conflict on exactly how many German fighter units received scramble orders that morning and how many complied. Scattered intercepts occurred. Flak and isolated fighter passes brought down several transports and gliders over the drop zones. 53 transport aircraft took damage sufficient to be listed as destroyed or beyond repair, but organized Luftwaffe fighter opposition against the main column never materialized in any strength the American escort even registered as a coordinated threat. A 9th Air Force intelligence summary from that evening described air opposition over the route as negligible. The word sits in the report without emphasis, as though stating the weather. What those German pilots saw from the ground defied every frame of reference their training provided. A formation of that size does something to the light itself. 1,700 aircraft and 1,300 gliders occupy enough of the visible sky that the color shifts. Blue gives way to a gray-brown haze of exhaust trails, wing surfaces catching morning sun in rippling sequence, shadows on the ground merging into a single moving darkness that slides across fields and roads and rooftops with the steady pace of something that cannot be stopped, because stopping it would require a force that no longer exists. The sound compounds the visual. Radial engines, Pratt & Whitney, R-1830s on the C-47s, Wright R-3350s on the C-46s, produce a collective roar at formation density that vibrates the chest cavity at a quarter-mile distance. German soldiers on the east bank of the Rhine reported feeling the sound in their teeth before they identified the source. The vibration built for minutes, peaked, held, and did not diminish because the formation kept coming. It did not stop. The stream had no visible end. A Jagdgruppe commander standing beside his aircraft at a field east of the Rhine, fueled, armed, engine cold, ran the calculations silently. His pilots averaged 80 hours total flight time. The Americans above him averaged 250. His Gruppe could put up perhaps 14 fighters. The sky held 900 American escorts that he could see, with more beyond visual range, 14 against 900. With his pilots outclassed individually before the numbers entered the equation. Launching meant losing every aircraft and every pilot for the possibility of destroying 8 or 10 transports that would be replaced from American factories before the month ended. The transports carried paratroopers who would land regardless, because killing 10 out of 1,700 changed nothing about the operation's outcome. He kept his engines cold. The formation passed. The arithmetic didn't require courage or cowardice to solve. It required only the ability to count. 63 hours. That number appears in a Luftwaffe personnel readiness report from March 1945, describing the average total flight time of replacement pilots arriving at Jagdgeschwader units in the Western Reich. 63 hours covers takeoff, landing, basic formation flying, and perhaps a handful of gunnery passes against a towed target. It does not cover instrument flying in cloud or combat maneuvering against an opponent. It certainly does not cover what happens when a P-51 drops out of a high cloud layer at 400 miles per hour on your 6 o'clock and you have approximately 2 seconds to brake or die. 63 hours meant a pilot could get his aircraft into the air and point it in a direction. Everything after that relied on luck, and luck had stopped working for the Luftwaffe sometime around the autumn of 1944. The mission boards at dispersal fields east of the Rhine on the morning of March 24th listed scramble readiness orders. The orders came from Luftwaffe Reich and carried the usual language: intercept enemy formations, engage transports, protect the crossing zone. Standard operational directives typed by staff officers in bunkers who could hear the formations overhead but could not see the faces of the men expected to fly against them. At several fields, the specific installations remain difficult to pin down because unit war diaries from this period are incomplete, damaged, or were deliberately destroyed in the final weeks. The response to those orders amounted to nothing. Aircraft sat in their revetments, engines stayed cold. Pilots who had dressed walked to their machines, and in some cases completed pre-flight checks, looked west, saw what filled the sky, and stopped. The records don't use the word refusal. A post-war FMS report, authored by a former JAG Division operations officer, describes the situation with careful phrasing. Individual readiness could not be achieved at several subordinate units due to personnel and material factors. Personnel and material factors. The bureaucratic language papers over something raw. Those personnel factors had names and faces and 63 hours in their logbooks, and they stood on frozen grass watching a formation pass that contained more aircraft than they had seen cumulatively in their entire abbreviated training. What does it feel like to know? Not suspect, not fear, but know with mathematical certainty that launching your aircraft means dying for nothing. The American formation answered that question by existing. A pilot with 63 hours cannot execute a high-deflection gunnery pass on a C-47 flying in a defended box. He cannot evade a P-51 flown by a man with 250 hours and a completed combat tour. Navigating back to his field after the engagement is irrelevant because the engagement will last 45 seconds and end with his aircraft burning in a Westphalian potato field. The young lieutenant standing beside his 109 at 0830 that morning did not need a staff college education to see this. He needed only his eyes and the ability to count. The same arithmetic his Gruppenkommandeur had already done and reached the same conclusion. 14 fighters against 900 escorts. The number doesn't produce a tactical problem. It produces a funeral. Some pilots did launch that morning. Scattered intercepts against the fringes of the formation, individual acts of aggression or obedience or habit or desperation that produced a few kills and cost the attackers disproportionately. A Feldwebel from an unidentified Jagdgruppe, captured later that week during the ground advance, told his American interrogators that he had watched 4 aircraft from his Staffel take off while he remained on the ground. 2 came back. 1 crashed on landing with hydraulic failure from battle damage. The pilot of the 4th, he said, flew into the formation and never returned, and nobody discussed him afterward, because discussing him meant discussing why the rest of them hadn't followed. The interrogation transcript, held in a military intelligence service file, notes that the Feldwebel showed no emotion while recounting this. He stated it the way a man states the weather. The interrogator's marginal note reads, "Subject appears resigned rather than demoralized. The distinction matters. Demoralized men might recover. Resigned men have finished calculating. The Luftwaffe that refused to take off on March 24th didn't collapse from fear. It collapsed from education." Every lesson the American war machine had taught since 1943 converged on that frozen taxiway east of the Rhine. Bodenplatte taught that even successful strikes against Allied air power changed nothing because the replacement pipeline made destruction temporary. The big week raids of February 1944 drove home a different point. American bomber formations would keep coming, regardless of losses, and the fighters escorting them would hunt you across Germany with the fuel to do it. The training disparity made individual combat skill irrelevant when the other side could produce competent pilots faster than you could produce mediocre ones. The 63-hour replacement pilot standing beside his Messerschmitt absorbed all of these lessons not through study, but through the sky above his head, which contained the proof. He looked up and saw an air force that could put 3,000 aircraft over a single river crossing on a Tuesday morning and treat the operation as routine. His own side couldn't generate enough sorties to contest a single squadron's patrol area. He did the arithmetic. The arithmetic said stay on the ground. He stayed on the ground. The formation passed. 16,000 paratroopers landed on the far bank, assembled, and began fighting eastward before his engine oil had cooled from the morning's pre-flight warm-up that went nowhere. What do you call an air force that exists on paper but won't leave the ground? The Americans had a word for it by the spring of 1945. They called it irrelevant, not defeated. Defeat implies a contest. The Luftwaffe over the Rhine on March 24th offered no contest. It offered silence. And silence from an enemy who possesses armed aircraft, fueled aircraft, pilots in cockpits with engines capable of starting. That silence communicates something more total than any shoot-down ratio or bomb damage assessment ever could. A 9th Air Force operational summary from the last week of March 1945 contains a line that should be carved somewhere permanent. Enemy air activity over the operational area has ceased to constitute a factor in planning. Ceased to constitute a factor. The American air staff had stopped including the Luftwaffe in their calculations, the way a man stops checking for wolves in a city. The threat category itself had been retired. This irritates me more than it should. How little attention Varsity gets compared to D-Day or Market Garden. Market Garden failed spectacularly and generated 1,000 books. Varsity succeeded so completely that it barely generated a paragraph in most general histories. The airborne troops landed, consolidated, linked up with ground forces crossing the Rhine by boat and bridge, and the war lurched forward another step toward Berlin. The Luftwaffe's absence from that sky didn't produce drama. It produced efficiency. 16,000 men crossed the Rhine by air against functionally zero air opposition, and the after-action reports read like a logistics exercise because that's what it had become. The enemy's decision to stay on the ground converted an airborne assault into an airborne delivery. Packages dropped, signed for, moved to the front. The violence happened on the ground after landing, not in the air during approach. American transport losses to ground fire, 53 aircraft destroyed, another 290 damaged, came exclusively from flak batteries that couldn't choose not to shoot because flak gunners don't do arithmetic the way pilots do. They traverse and elevate and fire. The guns worked until the guns were overrun. The pilots who could choose chose nothing. A captured Luftwaffe general major interrogated at a CSDIC facility in England, weeks after Varsity described the situation on the Western Front more clearly than most staff college lectures manage. According to the interrogation summary, he stated that by March of 1945, the Luftwaffe in the West retained approximately 1,000 fighter aircraft on strength across all commands. Of these, perhaps 400 could be made serviceable on any given day. Of those 400, fuel allocations permitted approximately 150 to fly. Of those 150, perhaps 80 carried pilots qualified for combat operations, meaning pilots with more than 100 hours total flight time. 80 fighters. The Americans put 900 escorts over the Rhine crossing alone, plus the 1,700 transports they escorted, plus the fighter bombers hitting flak positions, plus the tactical reconnaissance flights mapping German positions in real time. The general used a phrase the translator rendered as operational irrelevance. He applied it to his own service, his own Air Force, the thing he had spent his career building. Operationally irrelevant. The transcript notes he said it without inflection. The 400 to 80 funnel explains why Bodenplatte's arithmetic guaranteed this morning's silence. Start with 1,000 airframes. Subtract 600 for maintenance failures, parts shortages, battle damage awaiting repair. Subtract 250 for fuel that doesn't exist, because the synthetic oil plants at Leuna and Pulitz and Brooks have been bombed so repeatedly that 8th Air Force target folders for those sites run to hundreds of pages of strike photography showing the same wrecked distillation towers, rebuilt and wrecked again. Subtract 70 for pilots who can fly but can't fight. The 63-hour men whose training ended when the fuel ran out, whose gunnery practice consisted of lectures with diagrams because ammunition allocation for training had dropped to zero in some units by February. 80 fighters left, 80 against 3,000. The ratio is 37 to 1. No Air Force in history has sustained combat operations at 37 to 1 and produced outcomes worth the expenditure. The Luftwaffe's leadership knew this. The pilots on the ground knew this. The only people who didn't know it were the staff officers in Berlin, still issuing scramble orders, and their ignorance had stopped mattering because the men receiving those orders had stopped obeying them. 46 days after Varsity, Germany surrendered. The Luftwaffe's last operational sortie in the West, sources conflict on the exact date and unit, but most accounts place it in the final days of April 1945, involved a handful of fighters scrambling against tactical aircraft over what remained of the shrinking Reich. The war ended, with roughly 6,000 German aircraft captured intact on airfields across Europe. 6,000 machines with nowhere to fly, nothing to burn, no one trained to fight in them, and no fuel to get off the ground even if all the rest had been solved. Operation Varsity put 1,696 transports and 1,348 gliders over the Rhine, escorted by over 900 fighters, carrying 16,500 airborne troops of the 17th Airborne Division and the British 6th Airborne Division. 53 transports lost. Total Allied aircrew killed in the air operation. Over 300. German fighter interceptions against the main formation column, effectively 0. The Feldwebel in the MIS interrogation file, the one who watched 4 of his Staffel take off and saw 2 return and 1 crash, said one more thing before the session ended. The interrogator asked him when he knew the war in the air had been lost. His answer, per the transcript, "I knew when I stopped being afraid of the order to fly and started being afraid of the sky."